March of the Machine was a huge punch in the gut of my investment in the Magic canon. That sentence made sense. Shut up. It was perhaps the biggest letdown I've experienced in Magic, and a further demonstration of WotC's inability to tell large-scale stories that don't just annoy and disappoint everyone. And due to MOM's nature as a set that affected everywhere in the multiverse, nowhere in all of Magic was safe from the grand cheapening effect the incredibly underwhelming Phyrexian invasion had on the game's lore. And so this past year and a bit of Magic stories and world building has been dampened for me by this ever-present stain. This looming reminder of how WotC's plans tend to turn out. Very few of the stories published in this time have excited me at all. The larger narrative they all fit into, even less appealing. It's just very hard to get invested when WotC have already shown you exactly what your investment gets you. And whilst we have had some good updates to existing planes in this time, including Karlov Manor, which was absolutely underrated, you and the Professor are wrong. Thunder Junction, one of the only new planes they've introduced during this period, is hands down my least favourite of all time. It's not close. But the news is pretty good. Bloomburrow is actually very exciting and cute, and relatively unique amongst Magic's planes. But the set to follow that, Duskmourn, House of Horrors, is the one that truly piques my interest.
Duskmourn is a plane contained entirely within one house. A sprawling, surreal, and impossible mansion that has grown to encompass the entire world that once housed it. In its history, the plane wasn't always this way. Technologically advanced, and even verging on discovering the multiverse itself, but nothing like the surrealist nightmare it has since become. During that distant period of normalcy, a powerful demon named Valgavoth was imprisoned within what once was an ordinary building. Unable to escape the house he was bound to, Valgavoth said, "F*** you then, loophole, there is nothing but this house." And so, bit by bit, the demon expanded the boundaries of the mansion, gradually trapping more and more of the world with him in his prison. Once the expansion was finally complete, the house had encompassed all the physical space on the plane. Now, seemingly years after the house's ascension, with the demon's consciousness woven throughout the endless corridors of his dark domain, the current human inhabitants of the mansion are survivors. Some descendants of the original plane's natives, others lured to the plane through doors opened between worlds, then trapped in an endless loop through the mansion's shifting rooms and halls. Running, hiding, fighting for their lives, pursued and terrorized by the myriad horrors contained within the demonic walls. For that terror is why they have been imprisoned here. So that Valgavoth can feed his eternal hunger and consume as much fear as possible from his interplanar abductees, before they're hunted and destroyed within the house's walls. Wow, what a premise. I couldn't be more in. When the majority of Magic settings can be roughly summarized as typical fantasy world plus Factor X, and then are marketed and differentiated by that Factor X, Vikings or school or fairy tales, for example, getting a plane built around such a comparatively unique idea with so much inherent storytelling pre-baked in is a breath of apathetic malaise clearing air. I do appreciate how similar in part this premise is to Mirrodin's, with a planar ruler who has restructured the place to fit his needs before abducting people from other planes to fill it. And I obviously love Mirrodin, so maybe I'm pre-programmed to like this, but that set wasn't trying to scare us, and it came out over 20 years ago. So in the modern era, Duskmourn definitely still feels fresh. WotC have actually already released the Planeswalker's Guide to Duskmourn, the lore and world-building overview article that accompanies most Magic sets, except Thunder Junction for some reason. When it was published, Duskmourn was roughly 3 months away, an age in Magic's current release schedule, and the equivalent article for Bloomburrow, which arrives before, isn't even out yet. At time of writing, it is actually out now, at time of saying. Regardless of what's motivated the Planeswalker's Guide's early release, in a world where countless worlds whiz past you in the blink of an eye, I really appreciate the increased time we've been given to ponder on Duskmourn's dark ideas. And it's been a long time since I found one of these articles quite so gripping. I strongly recommend it. I've linked it below. Emily Teng does a great job painting us an imagination-capturing picture of the uniquely horrifying plane, outlining the house's premise and operation, its inhabitants, and the zones that make it up. The ever-changing but differing sections of the Grand House that each evoke one of Magic's 5 colours, as well as a 6th section beneath them, that leads to the demon himself. The descriptions of the environments and the land art that accompanies them are excellent for setting the mood of the house. Empty foyers that ring with eerie silence. Corridors lined with uncanny marble statues and draped with white fabric that ripples in unfelt breeze. Trees, plants, and other vegetation invade dining rooms and corridors, and even act as support beams for ceilings lost somewhere amongst the canopy. The 5 colours have been used to create varying versions of horror before, but never in a context quite like this. Their differing themes and aesthetics here flavouring surreal architectural aberrations, the mundane and familiar twisted against the colour pie into the uncanny and unnerving. The guide establishes a very effective tone for its eerie environments and gives us just enough information to get a real sense of each zone, whilst allowing a lot of undefined room for the surreal nature of the setting to stretch its hideously abstracted limbs out into the dark recesses of our imaginations. Excellent stuff! So why is this video's title like that? Well, it's with the detailing of the house's monsters that I start to have issues. Far more words than the environment got are dedicated to the house's various monsters, and they are a delightfully creepy and diverse collection of supernatural stalkers. Some new creatures created for Duskmourn, others variations on Magic's existing monsters, warped to fit the house. From the cellar spawn to the glitch ghosts, visually and flavourfully, all of the creatures detailed gel with the house and the tone it's setting. And many have exciting premises of their own, such as the Wickerfolk, the unfortunate fate of some of the plane's previous inhabitants, who turned to a dark ritual to ward themselves against fear and Valgavoth's hunger for it. Instead, the ritual stripped them of sensation and mortality, trapping them in unfeeling wicker bodies, but with minds that remained intact. Cut off from experiencing the world, but completely unable to die, all they long for now is to force others to share the same fate. This is also good stuff. No individual monster is causing me issues with its premise. I like all these monsters. They're good monsters, Brent. But the guide does each of them, and in turn the setting, the same disservice. They're all over-explained. For every one of them, we learn exactly what they are, exactly where they've come from or who created them, exactly how they act, exactly where their allegiances lie, and exactly how to beat them. There's almost nothing left to the imagination, as the guide belabors every single facet of every single creature inside the house. And it's just so wrong-headed.
Horror thrives on the unknown. If you want to scare your audience, giving them just enough information to go off, whilst withholding as much as possible, is going to be far more effective than telling them everything up front. Tension and fear ramp up far more with minimal info offered, giving your audience the opportunity to ponder, fret, and fixate on what's coming next, whilst giving their imaginations the chance to do the same, bringing something of themselves to the horror as they fill in the space with their own fears. This stuff is playing with such base human emotions, it's almost intuitive. We all feel it, even if it's not explicitly thought. Usually the least scary part of any horror story is when the concealed monster is finally shown, when all the subtlety of the build-up dissipates and the object of our fear is finally thrust into the light. Even if the design is suitably scary, all the tension of the unknown is gone, along with any personal connection that you might have woven between the undefined and your own imagination. You're not afraid of the dark because it's inherently terrifying. You're afraid of what you think it might be concealing.
The worst example of Duskmourn's guide explaining away all the tension and horror comes with the description of the Beasties. In the weeks that followed as we came to know each other, it was my companion, my guardian. It became my friend, in every sense of the word, but only, I came to understand, if I never tried to look at what lay beneath its mask. Chirp, survivor. Beasties are one of the few benevolent creatures that dwell within the house. Large furry monsters who long for affection from survivors, and, in turn, will loyally guard them against harm. But each beastie also wears a mask, or several. They fiercely protect what's hidden underneath these masks, and if a survivor is unlucky enough to glimpse the true face of a beastie, their relationship will be severed. At best, the beastie will leave them in shame, and at worst, attack their former friend, in anger of the revelation. What could cause the beasties such humiliation and rage? What are they hiding that could be so horrible as to make them kill their former friends just to keep the secret? What is the terrible truth of a beastie's true face? Let's see. Their real faces are visages of dried flesh tethered to exposed skulls. Terrifying, hideous mockeries of living flesh. So basically, it's just gross under there, and the Beasties are embarrassed about it. Phew, for a second the mystery was actually getting me interested. Thank God all that confusion's over, and every single possible question that anyone could possibly have about Duskmourn has already been definitively answered. You know what would have been better than, oh, they're just ugly? Nothing. As in, it would have been much better if you didn't have an answer to the mystery at all. Just letting players indefinitely guess would have been a billion times more exciting than the dullest, shittest reason that any character in anything would have for wearing a mask. It's usually the mark of a good Planeswalker's guide to go into extensive detail. Often the guide becomes one of the most definitive collections of information on a plane's lore, and the more relevant info there is, the better our understanding of the plane. More info equals more good guide, so I can see the good intentions that led to this over-explanation. And it is a pitfall that WotC have failed to avoid before. I still remember the feeling of disappointment that washed over me when reading The Art of Innistrad, and it informed me of exactly what the Geists were and exactly how they worked, and just sucked all the mystery away from the concept of ghosts on the gothic horror plane. Don't worry, Duskmourn's ghosts are completely explained by that guide too. But to their credit, WotC have also done this better in the past as well. The 3 brood lineages, the article that accompanied Rise of the Eldrazi, detailed the 3 brood lineages of the Eldrazi.
Ugh, god damn it. Oh, god damn it! Well, I was going to show you, but like way too many of the articles on WotC's site, it's no longer there. And it doesn't even work in the Wayback Machine this time for some reason, so I guess you'll just have to take my word for it.
In addition to the Planeswalker's Guide to Zendikar that had released in the year before, this feature took an in-universe approach to its presentation, describing the then new alien Eldrazi from the perspective of someone on Zendikar, with the only information available being that which could be observed by the people of Zendikar as they struggled against the newly emerged monstrosities. And this fragmented and unreliable approach has been used in a few Planeswalkers guides, and was fantastic for giving this new, strange group of creatures an aura of mystery, which fed directly into their otherworldly nature. I can't help but think that approach would have worked far better in Duskmourn's guide, both for retaining the horror-inducing mystery and at grounding us within the choking walls of the house, rather than the detached view of the place the objective, detached narrator gives us. The guide almost feels like it's prepping me to jump into Duskmourn, the co-op video game, giving me everything I need to know about the well-trodden strategies of the current meta that I must employ to beat the well-defined, predictably behaving enemies. I can already hear the survivors of Left 4 Dead shouting, Celespawn!
Tank!
Wickerfolk!
Smoker!
Razorkin!
Witch!
I know I could have picked a more recent video game example than Left 4 Dead, but I'm old, okay? And Duskmourn is absolutely reminding me of Left 4 Dead's pulpy, trigger-happy approach to horror, where it's more of a flavour than a major theme. An approach that works a lot better for a fast-paced shooter than it does a ponderous card game named Duskmourn, House of Horror. But despite this problem, I am still really excited for Duskmourn. It's just such a good premise that even if it's been overexposed already, I can't wait to dig further in. Honestly, with an idea this strong, it'd take something really obnoxious to dampen my excitement. So, what do those survivors in the house actually look like, eh? Ah. Oh. Yuck. For whatever reason, Wizards have decided to give Duskmourn an aesthetic that's inspired by horror media of the 80s through the modern day. And so within the demonic walls, you can see stacks of CRT, TVs, clunky, chunky tech covered in wires, screens, and antenna, and costumes that look straight out of the last nostalgic revival media property that you've forgotten the name of because they all look the bloody same. The survivors of Duskmourn are decked out in clothes that evoke all the excesses of angular 80s fashion and costuming. There's nary a downward-facing collar in sight, nay, they're all popped towards the sky, alongside an array of headbands, body warmers, mullets, t-shirts, thick-rimmed glasses, and f***ing high-top trainers, which is what we call sneakers, my mostly American audience. Like the most LARP-obsessed visitors LaserQuest got that day, the survivors are also lugging around bulky tech with hard plastic edges that evokes mass production. Hardly any survivors can be seen without the green glow of gaudy, knockoff PKE meters clutched in their hands or hanging from their belts. You might wonder if the design of these props, as that's exactly how these weapons feel, actually looked any further than Ghostbusters for inspiration, as we've got survivors lugging around bargain bin proton packs too, also accented in loud, garish neon green. This all produces a viscerally negative reaction in me. One that's going to need me to do some media and self-psychoanalysis to understand. Looking at these clothes and this tech, all I want to do is let out a long groan that's equal parts disgust and disappointment. I hate this. I hate this. This isn't just clashing with the comparatively restrained aesthetic of many of Duskmourn's rooms, this clashes with basically every magic aesthetic that we've ever seen before. And whilst I find this jarring and horrible, it does represent the results of a recent trend in MTG. Now, it is indeed true that in the last few years, Magic has introduced a few worlds that have had more advanced societies, with a more advanced tech level than we'd been used to from the previous planes of Magic's fantasy setting. It is also true that Magic has featured more sci-fi elements than most fantasy IPs since its beginning. But in the earlier days, whilst wayward futuristic elements would show up, the focus was very rarely on technologically advanced societies or worlds. In 2016, Kaladesh introduced us to the Indian-inspired Aetherpunk world, where their relatively modern society seemed to surpass even the technology of our own world. 2022 took us back to Kamigawa, but long into the plane's future since we'd last seen it. Now, the Japanese-inspired plane also has a comparatively modern society that is also enhanced by relatively advanced tech, except neon-flavoured rather than steampunk. Soon after Kamigawa, we visited New Capena for the first time. The Art Deco world was heavily inspired by the art and culture of the 1920s, and featured some advanced tech, but also introduced a lot of modern/real-world amenities to the world of MTG. Crowded train stations, suits with vests and ties, skyscrapers, power tools, boxing rings, traffic lights, and for the first time in Magic, cars. Oh god, I'm sure there's some edge case that makes that not true. Maybe if I find it, we can put it on screen now, but I'm pretty sure that's the first time. Stylized old-timey Art Deco cars with hover orbs instead of wheels, but unmistakably cars nonetheless. I remember hearing from some older Magic the Gathering players that, for them, Kaladesh crossed a line. That the drones and trains and the personal helicopters were a technological step too far, and as a result, Kaladesh didn't feel much like a fantasy setting, and it didn't feel much in line with the already established worlds of Magic's multiverse. Whilst I could see where they were coming from, this wasn't a critique I shared at the time. The delicate filigree of Kaladesh's unique aesthetic gave it a fantastical distance to reality in my eyes, and despite Kamigawa, Neon Dynasty, not having quite such a unique look as Kaladesh, that same distancing allowed the technological advancements of that plane to work for me too, even if slightly less so. Once New Capena rolled around, the returning criticisms of the aging Vorthoses started to ring truer. Despite the stylization, the modern trappings of New Capena brought with them a greater sense of familiarity. Now, familiarity and relatability can be fantastic things for your setting to evoke. I've praised Ravnica many times for effectively marrying the fantastical and the mundane. And for my money, New Capena did do this well for the most part. The Art Deco aesthetic brought a degree of elevating grandeur to the more regular elements of city life. But it was difficult to deny that the 1920s inspired city was far closer to our world than any plane we'd seen so far. And due to that closeness to the monotony of reality, for the first time it felt like the elevated and fantastical weren't always being complemented, but instead being reduced by the familiar and the mundane. Whilst I was moaning about the 80s isms of Duskmourn on Twitter, two people in the replies had a mini but enlightening exchange that effectively expresses some of what I find so off-putting about the Survivor's look. So I'm going to share it with you, and I asked them both if they wouldn't mind. Thinking about it, Kamigawa's technology is way more advanced, but it still fits somehow. Maybe it's the distance? Like, CRT screens belong to the recent past, but cyberpunk is more of a future thing, and that feels more distant? Maybe we could also view it this way. If fantasy is about engaging with the past through a fantastical lens, there will be a point where CRT screens can be accepted as part of it. Goldstark Knight makes a fantastic point about historic styles eventually aging into fantasy acceptable range. If our past-focused conception of what fantasy is, or should be, is informing our opinions of Magic's aesthetics, perhaps these elements wouldn't feel so out of place in a future that's further away from them. Maybe you're even young enough that they don't feel quite so out of place to you. But for me, this is absolutely a moment where my preconception about what Magic worlds are supposed to look like has been uncomfortably expanded. That sounded grosser than I meant. But even with as I showed, the precedent established by Magic's other planes being shifted over the last few years, Duskmourn does feel like we're being pushed another rung up the ladder of what's acceptable, air quotes, of Magic's admittedly very varied, but ultimately still fantasy setting. Maybe the ladder metaphor doesn't quite gel with uncomfortably expanded. Nah, you can expand something with a ladder with enough gel. It'd just be uncomfortable. Anyway, as Goldstark Knight aptly identifies, the lack of distance to reality is the real issue. A reply from Charlotte perfectly outlines the problems that can arise from not creating that distance. The issue is fantasy and escapism. Seeing an unmodified CRT makes me feel slammed back to reality, not whisked away from it. Part of what makes it so jarring is how Duskmourn's look evokes the relatively recent past of our own world. Throughout my childhood, this is how TVs looked. I remember playing games even up to the 360 PS3 era on a bloody tube TV. But even more relevant than that, go outside or just scroll through social media a little bit, and you will see somebody with this exact haircut. Maybe you have it yourself. I have a pair of shoes that look just like these ones. I bought them for a Hotline Miami costume, but I wore them until they died. If I wanted to finally replace them, I could walk down to Primark right now and buy some more. The styles Duskmourn is referencing are so contemporary, they aren't even done cycling through the mainstream every few years. And that is definitely part of what is irking me so much about Duskmourn's look. The 80s aren't that close behind us anymore, but the trends they inspired still are. Stranger Things might not have begun the 80s throwback horror genre a few years ago, but it definitely went a long way in establishing it as a trend. 80s nostalgia in general has been pervasive since at least the early 2000s, and in the years since Stranger Things, that backwards-gazing style of horror has remained present and produced a fair amount of relatively similar media. It's not at its heyday currently, but nostalgic 80s horror is, at this point, a well-trodden aesthetic and basically a genre in of itself. And that trend is likely the first thing that anyone will think of when first seeing Duskmourn, seemingly intentionally on Watsy's part. When I see this character staring into his monstrous reflections, I don't think, look at this poor survivor and the terrifying visages this mirror is conjuring. What secrets or fates do these warped reflections hold? And I don't even think, look at this f***ing whatever kids say nowadays instead of hipster, where can I get his jacket? I think, look at this f***ing character that's been designed to remind me of the 80s and also probably of how much I like Stranger Things. These clothes and this tech and these colors don't help me sink into the unique world of Duskmourn. They take me right out of it by making me think either of the last guy on the street I saw wearing them, or just of the recent media trend, because they're so damn indistinctive from the rest of the bloody media trend. And given how busy they've been cribbing notes, it would be nice if Wizards could take inspiration from the actual peril that you can find within the other media making up this trend. Even if the main heroes almost always make it out, Stranger Things at least tries to make you feel like the characters are in some kind of real danger. Obviously we don't have all the art yet, but this is what Watsy chose to show us. These two removal spells show survivors in some kind of peril, but every piece of art where the survivors are the focus frames them as so capable, so ready to take on the horrors of the house, and so uninterested in inviting our care or empathy. Does this person's smug pose make you concerned for their safety? What about this person? Drowning in clothes and tech that evoke all the excesses of 80s consumerism and nothing about surviving in a house that wants to scare you to death. I'm fine with the visiting MTG heroes being presented without fear, but having this be true for every single person we see just serves to make the house less intimidating. How am I supposed to fear for these characters when they're not even afraid themselves? All of these factors converge to make Duskmourn feel very artificial. Its seeming lack of interest with establishing a sense of mystery or peril, combined with its visual distance from the other worlds of the multiverse, combined again with its closeness to our own world, combined even further with its closeness to many other recent, visually similar intellectual properties, leaves Duskmourn feeling like little more than a marketing gimmick. A product designed with soulless intent to resemble a different, already popular franchise and the well-worn genre it spawned as closely as legally possible. If I was being very charitable, I'd say that this derivative style was likely adopted because it's visually distinctive from Magic's other worlds. That WotC wanted Duskmourn to feel different from its already established horror worlds, and so a more appropriate horror aesthetic for a horror house setting, like Gothic, was dropped in order to set Duskmourn apart from, say, Innistrad. But that's not what I actually believe led us here. At least not primarily. The look of Duskmourn's survivors and tech is just so jarring and contemporarily unoriginal that it's hard not to imagine it was a decision made at the corporate level. A choice appealing to, or maybe even enforced from, on high, for its potential marketability and profitability. Not only did the artificiality this decision caused suck the horror away from the setting even more than the over-explanation did, it leaves Duskmourn feeling so cheap and feeble. So unable to stand on its own, and so undeserving of our respect. Are Wizards of the Coast so lacking for ideas that they need to flavor their new horror plane with the blandest, weariest, most derivative style available? The company that has created so many imaginative fantasy worlds in the past. The company that never stops world building can't create a unique horror aesthetic of their own and instead have to lean on an incredibly tired and overexposed trend? It speaks to a lack of confidence in your own world building ability. It screams it, honestly. When I look at Duskmourn's costumes, I think, you hacks. You idealist losers. Try again and have some more bloody faith in yourself next time. Which admittedly is a very harsh reaction, and one that is pretty rare for me to have in regards to the world building of Magic. But one that I worry might start to become more common. I said in the March of the Machine video that even when the story routinely falls flat on its face, the world building that accompanies each set is still incredibly impressive, and the real tragedy of the story's failure is how much of a disservice it does to Magic's well-crafted settings. Even for the worlds I don't particularly like. I may not have been a massive fan of Ikoria or Coldheim or Strixhaven, but I could understand the appeal of them, and appreciate all the effective world-building work that went into each of them. But since the March video, whilst we've had some updates to old planes that have been great, and an excellent new world in the form of Bloomburrow, we've also had some serious and unprecedented world-building blunders. I liked Murders at Karlov Manor and its story and lore more than a lot of people, it seems. But it's difficult to deny that the overabundance of detectives and their fedoras, gelling neither with Ravnica's established style nor societal structure, felt like a world-building misstep when we last returned to the city world. And the set that followed that, Outlaws of Thunder Junction, introduced us to the titular Thunder Junction, a western plane where nearly every element of it feels half-baked, contradictory, poorly executed, ugly, ham-fisted, and transparently cynically motivated. And despite definitely needing quite a lot more explanation, cheers, Thunder Junction didn't get a Planeswalker's Guide or equivalent at all. The elements that I don't like of Magic's previously consistent world building have gone from things I don't personally connect with to mistakes that I think are actively bad, the result of poor decisions and poor execution. I hope it's too early to really tell, and that I'm just being a presumptively negative Nelly, but I don't think it is, and I don't think I am. And it really does seem like Duskmourn is going to be on that list. The mistakes list. 80s nostalgia was too powerful an ingredient to add, one that can't really be sprinkled in, and attempting to do so has overpowered and warped the whole dish. The flavor of horror has almost been lost under the overwhelmingly metallic tang of artificiality. I don't need, and would be silly to expect, a card game to actively scare me. I don't need glitch ghosts to replace the lady from The Grudge in The Uncertain Shadows at the end of my bed. But that's not the point in establishing an effective horror tone in Duskmourn anyway. None of Innistrad's cards leave me paralyzed awake at night, but the effective tone of that setting helps me empathize with the characters, feel the stakes, and believe the bloody world. And with all this fake crap getting in the way of anything potentially scary about Duskmourn, I just don't believe in the world. It doesn't feel like a real place to me. I just don't buy it. Largely because every single decision in its construction seems to have been tuned to get me to buy it. The trend that Duskmourn is cynically chasing to hopefully chase its profits has left it far less interesting to me than its incredibly exciting premise should have. A lack of consideration to the concept of mystery has definitely done some damage to the plane's ability to scare us, but the real cost comes from its jarring, tired aesthetic, sapping away what should be special about Duskmourn, whilst leaving behind a garish, neon sheen, evoking little beyond greed, cynicism, and a lack of faith in world-building ability. A lack of faith I've been sharing lately. Thanks for watching, everybody, because that's what you say at the end of YouTube videos. Didn't you know? Yes, you did. You've seen them. I wanted to script this video rather than just rambling into the camera, which definitely made it take a little longer, but we got it out in time. I specifically avoided as many opinions about Duskmourn as I could, aside from the few people that replied to me on Twitter. Just like with my last video, I know there's a Pleasant Kenobi video that looks like it might be similar, but I have not seen it. I was staying in a log cabin, so I thought I'd use the opportunity. Maybe the fake candle undercut the tone a bit? Or maybe it was a metaphor for Duskmourn. I know my ending was pretty dour, and maybe gave a sour, impression of my opinion of Duskmourn than is accurate. But I like it, so I'm not changing it. And whilst I did a good job capturing the viscerally negative nature of my reaction, I feel, the only thing I truly hate about Duskmourn is the hacky costumes. And the trend in magic they represent, I suppose. But the idea for the world is just so good that I'm still super excited. And the story's been good so far, and it's getting me more into the world. It does an excellent job painting a believable Duskmourn. But to be honest, it does clash even further with the style. For example, the way the tech is described in the story, it's like scavenged, with glass from jars, and wires made from melted down cutlery. Whereas, in all the art, the tech looks like Nerf products. And it definitely doesn't look scavenged at all. My next video won't be negative. This hasn't been my intention to make a bunch of negative videos. It's just negativity is what magic has been inspiring in me lately, unfortunately. Until that time, please like this video. Please. Please. And subscribe to the channel. More, please. And there's Instagram and Twitter accounts as well, if those interest you. But even more interesting than that is my Patreon, where you, like the glorious few who are already there, can become a Mia by giving me money. Receiving some extra bits, but most importantly, an incredibly gracious thank you from me. Your support is infinitely appreciated, patrons. I'm really not a rich man, and it honestly makes all the difference. I can't tell you how many times I've avoided being overdrawn because of Patreon. So thank you, my Brass Squire and Parcel Mia patrons. Behold each of their illustrious names. And an even grander thank you, featuring a sweaty handshake, an awkward hug, and too much eye contact. To all the Mia crammed into the battlesphere. My gratitude can only be expressed by verbalizing each of their names. Sebastian Rees, Storfeting, Marshall Mia, Eric Vaughan, Librarian of Leng, Steve-O, Santiago Ardea, Chonga the Banished Mole King, Patrick Dane, Mimeo, Bob, and Dark Flame. Bottomless thank yous all. And everyone's reward for making it to the very end will be Hedge Witch's Mask.